Hi, welcome to this video in which I'll be sharing 6 tips for passing the SQE2. The first tip is to prioritize mastering the relevant SQE1 knowledge for SQE2. Luckily, SQE2 tests fewer subjects than SQE1. So in SQE2, you don't need to revise for the legal system of England and Wales, constitutional and administrative and EU law, solicitors' accounts, and large parts of legal services. So that makes revising the functioning legal knowledge part a bit easier. There's fewer subjects to cover. But those remaining subjects, it's very important that you do master the content in them. In SQE1, you have the luxury of having the answer on the page. Sure, you need to pick it out from 5 different answers, but the answer is there. And that can act as a trigger for what the answer is. If you've covered the information in the past, seeing it on the page might remind you what the answer is, compared to if you just had to type out what the answer was. In SQE2, you don't have the luxury of having the answer in front of you. You need to know what the relevant information is. So as an example, in an advocacy assessment for dispute resolution, you might need to make an application to set aside a default judgment. Potentially that could be one of the tests that comes up. You need to know what that test is. They will not give you the test. In SQE1, it's different. If you had a question on setting aside a default judgment, one of the answers might have the answer there in front of you that can remind you what it is. But for SQE2, you won't have that luxury. You need to know the information so that you can recount that and put it into your answer. So that's why it's very important that you continue to prioritize your SQE1 knowledge and mastering that, alongside getting better at the individual practical assessments. The second tip is to take a look at the marking criteria and the performance criteria for SQE2, so you can understand exactly what will you be marked on. There's going to be a mixture of marks for your functioning legal knowledge and also for the practical skills that you demonstrate. But the practical skills that you'll be tested on vary per assessment. So it's a good idea to take a look at the marking criteria and the performance criteria. I'm going to link those in the description and you can take a look at that maybe after the video's ended. There's a lot of useful tips in there. So an example of one tip is in relation to the advocacy assessment, when it mentions that you'd be scored positively if you avoid terms such as I believe or I think. Instead, you should use more neutral, objective language. It is the submission of the claimant that XYZ, rather than personal terms like I think or I believe. So take a look at the marking criteria, performance criteria. It is quite long, so I'm just going to link that in the description and maybe take a look once this video's finished. The third tip is to create structures for each of your SQE2 assessments, so that as soon as you enter into that assessment, you're not having to waste time organising your answer or thinking how to structure it. You already have a pre-existing structure that you can slot into the relevant information. I might create separate videos on structures you can use for each of the SQE2 assessments. If that's something you'd find useful, then please leave a comment below. But an example structure would be for the advocacy assessment. So you could begin by, in your draft structure, beginning your answer by using the correct mode of address. So if the judge that's presiding over the assessment is district judge, you'd use the term judge. If it's circuit judge, you'd use the term Your Honour. So you can begin the answer by using the correct mode of address. That immediately highlights that aspect of your knowledge, that you know how to address the judge correctly. So as an example, in the advocacy assessment, if it's a district judge, first part of it would be judge. Second part of it can be highlighting who you're acting for. So, judge, I act on behalf of the claimant or the defendant in this matter. The third part can be highlighting what the application is for or what the submission is going to be about. So an example would be, this is an application for set aside of a default judgment. The fourth part can be checking that the judge has access to the relevant documents, so making sure that they have the bundle. It's the assessment, so most likely they will have that with them. The fifth part can then be checking with the judge if they'd like you to summarise the relevant facts. If they'd like you to summarise them, then you can go ahead with that. If not, then you can move on to the next part. The next part would then be highlighting what the difference is in the positions between the claimant and the defendant, if there's a dispute around that. So, yeah, you'd argue that the claimant, if it's set aside of default judgment, that the defendant had obtained judgment, but the claimant submits that should not have been obtained for XYZ reasons. You would then move on to highlighting what the test is for what you're applying for. So if it's set aside of default judgment, you'd highlight the relevant test, and you'd break it down into its individual parts, addressing each part in turn and highlighting how that part of the test is met. You'd then finish that by highlighting that the test is met, if that's the case, and requesting that the judge, in this case, set aside the default judgment. You then essentially summarise what you've been through and check with the judge if they have any further questions or anything else they want you to go through. Throughout this, there are certain phrases that you will use that you should learn. So I mentioned in the previous tip, it highlights in the marking criteria, avoid phrases like I think, I believe, and use more objective language, such as it is the claimant's position, claimant's submission, whatever it is that XYZ. Same with finishing the response. A good way to finish it is, unless I can assist you any further, this concludes my submissions. Rather than, Judge, do you have any questions? That is a standard way of ending the submission. So it's good to learn phrases like that. So the third tip is to create structures for each of the SQE2 assessments so that you're able to be more efficient the moment you enter into that assessment. The fourth tip is to complete mocks on each of your SQE2 assessments so that you are comfortable and familiar with each of them, with how they work, to identify your weaknesses in potentially any of them, and also to get familiar with the time frames for each, because they do vary quite a bit for each assessment. So for legal research, for example, you have a full hour to deal with that. For legal writing, you only have 30 minutes. So you need to get used to the time frames for each one. It's also good so that you're able to identify weaknesses, as I said, and strengthen those up. So for the verbal assessments, if you are less comfortable with verbal delivery in front of someone else of an assessment, then you'd want to practice that so that you're comfortable on the day itself. So you can do practice runs of the advocacy and interviewing assessments with family members or friends. It's a good idea as well that when you do those practice runs, you ask that friend or family member to take a different position or behave in different ways, because you don't know exactly how the person who you'll be delivering to on the day will be like. So for the interviewing assessment, for example, in one you could just ask them if they can be open to sharing information and friendly. That could be one type of client you could get. You could also ask them if they could behave closed and not share much information with you and require you to ask much more questions, or to behave somewhat emotionally during the interviewing assessment, because maybe one of the things in the actual assessment you get is to see how do you respond when a client exhibits emotion, and do you continue to behave professionally. Of course, you don't know exactly what you will get in the exam, how that person that you are interviewing or delivering your advocacy assessment to will behave. So you want to get used to a variety of different behaviors so that you're able to respond to them naturally if and when they occur in the advocacy assessment or interviewing assessments. With the written assessments, equally as important that you do practice runs of them. And for something like drafting as well, that's quite useful to do practice runs of. There's so many documents that could potentially be tested, but it's a good idea if you take a look at a lot of the common documents so that you're familiar with them and you know how they should be completed. Some documents have particulars in terms of how they should be completed. So shareholders' minutes, for example, a meeting of shareholders, the minutes for that has its own particularities in terms of how it needs to be completed. So it's a good idea if you cover various types of documents for drafting and you understand how to complete them. Legal research is a bit easier because you only need to practice essentially the structure of how you deal with it. It's not something you can prepare for exactly, like in terms of the knowledge itself. Often what's tested in legal research is things that are not in the SQE syllabus, because that's the point. Then you have to look into the relevant sources and produce an answer. So that legal research is something that you just need to get familiar with in terms of identifying the correct information, using the best sources, structuring the answer then appropriately. So that's the fourth tip. Make sure that you complete plenty of mock assessments on each of the SQE2 exams so that you're comfortable and familiar with them. The fifth tip is to familiarize yourself with the written assessment system. So you can access a version of it through Pearson's website. I'll link that in the description. It's a good idea to get used to how the written exam is going to look for each different assessment, how you access things like attachments, and getting used to functionality tools like the copy and paste function, because you can't copy and paste in the way you might normally use, where you highlight the text, right click and click copy. You need to use particular keys to be able to copy and paste across. The SRA have published a full guide on how you can do copy and pasting in the SQE2 exam. So I'll link that in the description. It's worth taking a look at that. The final tip is to take a look at Kaplan's published mocks for each of the SQE2 verbal assessments. So they've published videos on YouTube of a mock for each of the advocacy assessments and each of the interviewing assessments. It's really useful to take a look at those performances because you can see what works well in those performances and you can then adopt those and use that in your own, and what potentially isn't so good in those performances and what you can try and avoid in your own. So really useful to take a look at those for that reason. Also, so you can get familiar with how the format will be on the day. It can be an intimidating experience going into the interviewing and advocacy assessments. So being able to see how the room will be, how it's structured, actually seeing that in video form can be really useful. So I'll link those YouTube videos in the description and take a look at those after the video's over. Those were 6 tips for passing the SQE2. I hope you found the video useful. As I mentioned throughout the video, there's a lot of links in the description, so take a look at those. Hopefully you find that content useful. If you found this video useful, please consider liking, leaving a comment or subscribing. And until the next video, best of luck with your preparations.